The second thing is a willingness to acknowledge our own blind spots. You cannot be an effective ally or co-collaborator with the marginalized in whatever category if you don't acknowledge by definition that they know more about their marginality than you will ever know, right? Which is to say that we have to be challenging on a racial level, those of us who are white, challenging others who are white to acknowledge that people of color are fundamentally the experts on their own experience. Which is why when I come in to speak, I'm not here to speak about the black and brown experience, because that is not my place nor my area of expertise. I know my people. I'm talking about whiteness. And I'm talking about how whiteness clouds our understanding of this and actually encourages a certain degree of obliviousness and ignorance, just like being male in a male-dominated society clouds our judgment about the way that women experience misogyny and rape culture, just like being straight does the same with straight supremacy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you are a member of the dominant group in whatever category, you have the luxury of being oblivious to the reality that other people live. And it doesn't matter if you're a good person. You still have the luxury of being oblivious. In my country, we see this all through history. We can go back and look at some of the polling data that was taken in the early 60s, before the civil rights movement had succeeded in obtaining some of the laws that were passed in the 1960s. So the Civil Rights Act in my country was passed in 64, Voting Rights Act was 65, Fair Housing Act was 68. But in 1962 and 63, when one of the big polling companies went out and asked a large representative sample of white people, do you think blacks are treated equally in your community? This is 1963 also. Sort of an easy question with an incredibly obvious answer in retrospect, right? It's the high watermark of the civil rights movement. It's the year of the March on Washington, right? So everybody ought to be able to answer this no, because normally 200,000 people don't go to Washington, D.C. in late August in the heat to just have fun. They're going because they're angry about something. There's something wrong. So when you ask white people, do you think blacks are treated equally? It should be an instantaneous answer in 1963. And now, if I were to ask white folks in my country, do you think blacks were being treated equally in 1963? They'd all pass the test, because it doesn't take any courage a half century or more later to admit how rotten things were. But in 1963, when the Gallup organization asked that question, 2 out of 3 white folks said, yeah, I think everything's pretty good. 1962, they asked white folks, do you think black children have the same chance to get a good education as white children? Now, come on, y'all. It's 1962. Again, not a hard question. But in 1962, 87 out of 100 white people were like, yeah, I think that's about right. I think black kids have just as good a chance to get good schooling. Now, in retrospect, I can look at that and I can sort of mock it. And we can look at it as borderline delusional. But what does it say? Were those bad people? Well, there's bad people in every group, good people in every group, so sure, some of it could be that. But see, I think the scarier answer is the reason that so many white folks didn't know, even when it was obvious, because it was obvious, right? It was on TV every night. Every night. You were getting footage of brutality meted out against black folk in places like Birmingham. There were only 3 stations, for God's sake. There was no cable. There was ABC, NBC, and CBS in my country. They all went off at midnight. Everybody was watching the same 3 stations, and yet white folks couldn't understand what they were seeing, not because they were bad people, but because they had the luxury of just tuning it out and remaining oblivious. And so even though it was coming into our living rooms every evening, and it was on our front pages every morning, and even though it's obvious in retrospect, white folks had the luxury of not knowing the truth, because you know why? It wasn't going to be on the test, was it? And by that, I mean whatever test we had to take to graduate from school and be deemed competent, whatever test we had to take to get into the next level of school, whatever test we had to take to get a professional certification for whatever job you might want, you didn't have to actually show that you understood black and brown reality. And that hasn't changed. It hasn't changed in my country, and it hasn't changed in your country. You can still be stone cold ignorant to the reality of First Nations peoples all across this continent and still be deemed competent to be a doctor, to be a social worker, to be a therapist, to have any particular job that you want. You don't have to know that. That's not on the test. You can remain oblivious. Now, on the other hand, black and brown folk, peoples of color all throughout my country and yours, they don't have that luxury, do they? They don't get to be ignorant to our stuff, those of us who are white. People of color better know our stuff. They better know the stuff that we think is important, because that is going to be on the test. Actually, that's going to be the whole test and nothing but the test, right? is going to be our stuff. And people of color are going to have to know it because that is the stuff you have to know to be deemed competent. That's privilege. When you don't have to know other people's truth, that's a luxury. And when you have to know other people's truth, that is a burden, especially when it isn't shared equally. You see, the privilege of obliviousness is a huge one. It gives me one less thing I got to worry about today, right? One less thing I got to know. And there's no shame in being oblivious, please. When I say we have to be responsible for being oblivious, it's not about shame and it's not about blame. People are oblivious to stuff, not their own fault. I'm oblivious to a lot. I'm oblivious to calculus, y'all. You know why? Because I never took it. You know why? Because they didn't make me. And if they weren't going to make me, I sure as hell was not going to volunteer for the abuse. Are you kidding? I knew I wasn't going to be an engineer, so I'm going to let somebody else do calculus. I'm glad if y'all like calculus, thank God, somebody's got to do that. It just wasn't going to be me. And so I knew that, and so I avoided taking it because they didn't require it of me. As a result, I don't know how to do it. If I were to stand up on this stage and try to do calculus for you tonight, anyone in this room who'd ever taken it would instantly know that I did not know what I was talking about. And you would probably turn to your neighbor because you're paying close attention, and you would say, didn't he just tell us that he never even took that class? Aha, exactly my point when it comes to identity. Because you see, in my country and yours, a lot of white folks act like we know when racism is affecting people of color better than people of color know it, and we never took the class. Do you understand what I'm saying? And a lot of men act as though we know when sexism is operating or if rape culture is even a thing better than women know, and we never had to take the class. And those of us who are straight and cisgendered, or those of us who have money, or those of us who are able-bodied, or those of us who are members of whatever dominant group act like we understand the systems of oppression that affect others who are not in those groups better than the people who are affected by it, and we never had to take the class. That's the problem. Unless we own our obliviousness, is we end up ignoring that the real source of wisdom are those who are most affected, and we need to learn to listen to them.